Welcome to this virtual Conservative Home and Save the Children event at Virtual Conservative Party Conference. I'm Paul Goodman, the editor of Conservative Home. This is the first event in our fringe programme that I'm chairing. I've been looking forward to it and the discussion that we're going to have now about how to ensure low-income families get through the coronavirus crisis. I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one as I call them in turn, and I'm going to make a few introductory remarks myself. I mean, it occurred to me in thinking about this event that we could well have done it even were coronavirus not happening, because the issues that we're going to discuss would largely be here anyway. They are complex and they range quite widely. So access to childcare, family finances, nutrition, which Henry Dimbleby especially is going to talk about, these we could have spoken about at any time, but obviously they've been impacted severely by coronavirus. There are unusual dimensions. While they've been obviously affected severely, I think the situation in schools, which we'll discuss, has been unique in the sense that first, many schools have been closed for much of the year, and then second, we've obviously been through the whole exam results trauma in the summer, which Vicky Ford, the minister, who I'll introduce in a moment, I seem to remember had to spend a lot of time making the government's case on the media as events go by. So I'm going to start, given where we are, with Henry. Henry is the lead, really, on the National Food Strategy, and he's also the co-founder of Leon, and I think a non-exec director at DEFRA, if I'm right. So Henry, why don't you tell us about part one of your report, which has been published this year. You're going to publish part two next year. So why don't you kick off?
Thank you, Paul. Look, long after this virus has passed, we are going to feel its presence. And that won't just be in the grief of the thousands of families who've lost loved ones. It won't just be in the indelible mark. It's clear that it's going to gouge into our economy, but it's going to be in the bodies and the prospects of our most vulnerable children. When I wrote part one of the food strategy in July, the financial consequences of lockdown were already being felt. Food bank use had doubled, which wasn't surprising given that we know that 17 million working people have less than £100 of savings to fall back on. At the time, the unemployment levels at the beginning of the year were 500,000. The OBR was forecasting 1.5 million unemployed as furlough unravelled. Earlier this week, DWP said it was preparing for 4 million unemployed. It is clear now that the rise in poverty as a result of social distancing measures and the virus will be even greater than we thought when I published in the summer. Even now, before the furloughs properly unwound, 1 in 7 say that they're struggling to afford to feed their families, which represents over 2 million children. And it's important because the effect of hunger on young bodies is both serious and long-lasting. It can alter body structure and function irreversibly. Malnutrition in pregnancy and early years is associated with chronic disease in adulthood. But it isn't just a child's health that suffers. We all know that those who are hungry at school struggle to progress and have a greater incidence of mental illness. During the lockdown, my charity in Hackney, Chefs in Schools, delivered food parcels to those in need. And I saw firsthand how wildly the prospects of children from different backgrounds in the same state schools even are diverging. Those like my children with a quiet room to work in, high-speed internet, nourishing food compared to their peers in cramped accommodation with intermittent access to online learning and too many going hungry. And I think that this is both an acute problem of the virus, but also, as you said, Paul, a long-term political issue. The scope of my strategy was not to redefine the benefit systems, although I did do an explication of what's going on in food banks. And if anyone wants to read the strategy, it's at nationalfoodstrategy.org. I happen to think, however, that however Herculean the efforts of Therese Coffey and DWP, universal credit is not going to ensure that every child is well nourished. And my recommendations focus on using 3 existing mechanisms that we knew worked well, we know work well, to make sure every child in this country has the nutrition to survive. So 1, to increase the Healthy Start vouchers, and I'm speaking to Joe Churchill about this, to £4.25 a week, and extend those to everyone in receipt of universal credit. And that provides additional fruit, vegetables and milk. And Iceland already, we've talked to, they're subsidising that to an extra £1, and I'm hopeful that the other supermarkets are going to follow suit. The second thing is extending the holiday activity and food programme. This is a fantastic programme, actually introduced by the Tory government, currently run on quite small trials, 50,000 children. But the results, it's 4 weeks, 4 days a week over the summer, food, exercise, and education for our most vulnerable children. And the results have been fantastic. And I recommend that we extend that across the country to children on universal credit. And then finally, expanding eligibility for free school meals in schools. We know that packed lunches have 1% of the nutrition of school, 1% of packed lunches have the nutrition of free school meals. We know that those children who are on the cusp have much worse nutrition. So if you look at the nutrition of children in the schools, the worst fed children are the children just after the cliff edge of free school meals. So I've suggested we extend that to everyone on universal credit. Because these things are linked to universal credit, as the economy improves, they unwind. I'm delighted that Marcus Rashford is campaigning to get them introduced. It's effectively £1 billion ask at a time when Treasury is going to be feeling the pressure. Everyone wants money. 3/4 of the budget's protected, so there isn't much to play for. But I believe that at a time when the pressure is on to reduce spending and for budget restraint, this would give a strong sign that even in that situation, government is prioritising the most vulnerable in the next generation. The problem is real. The government knows that. These solutions are proven to work, provide excellent value for money, and are supported at targeting the most disadvantaged children. And it would give the strongest possible sign that the government was serious about levelling up. If anyone, by the way, wants any evidence or get in touch about what I've said today, get in touch at henry@henrydimbleby.com. But I will leave it at that and look forward to the debate. Thank you, Paul.
Henry, thank you very much. Although Vicky Waterman has just joined us, Vicky, welcome. I'm actually, just while you settle down, I'm going to go next to Kirsty McNeill, the Executive Policy Director at Save the Children, with whom we're sharing this event. And she's both going to respond to some of the points that Henry made and set up her own stall.
Thanks, Paul, and a huge thanks to you and your colleagues at ConservativeHome, for all of us, I think, who spent life in lockdown glued to television news to try and work out what's happening to our friends and neighbours and families and communities across the country. I feel we have heard a lot about families who are struggling with quarantine and travellers, and there's been lots of vox pops at airports, and we've heard rightly a lot on the television news about what's happening for small businesses who are worried whether their operation is still viable. I don't feel we have heard a lot about experiences for children and families. It's been somewhat missing from the national debate. So we're incredibly grateful for the work that Henry and others are doing, and that you and colleagues at ConservativeHome are doing to try and bring children and families' experiences to the forefront. Obviously, at Save the Children, we work with families and communities every single day, and we've done a huge amount of research over this crisis to work out what's really happening with families. And I would just draw attention to 2 things that we found through that research. So the first is that we have delivered emergency grants to 3,000 families And those emergency grants have been made up of help with food, so some emergency vouchers for food, for household items, because of course we had huge numbers of families suddenly having their very small flats turned into classrooms. And we experienced lots of families where the kids' classroom desk was suddenly the end of a bed, and they used to do arts and crafts or learning activities, or play was the kitchen floor. So we've given support for household items, for emergency help with food, and to buy toys and books, and of course some help for children's early learning. So 3,000 families we've been working with intensely to find out their experiences under lockdown. The second piece of research was with a further 3,000 families that we did joint with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And in that, we found 7 in 10 families who were claiming universal credit or the child tax credit were having to cut back on essentials. And sometimes when we talk about these things, they sound incredibly abstract, as if there is a policy debate happening about the benefit system at large and essentials in the abstract. To be clear what that means, that's families cutting back on things like nappies. So this is no sense discretionary spending. This isn't people cutting back on cancelling the Sky subscription. This is families who are having to use fewer nappies than their child needs because of the pressure on family finances. It's cutting back on bills. And again, that can sound abstract, but that means there might only be 2 meals instead of 3 a day, and parents having to pick which meal. So when we talk about this, it's important, I think, to realise that families are the best forecasters. This is the other thing that we've discovered. They have been well ahead of the forecasters of the Treasury, well ahead of our own research findings, because what families have said to us is, thank you so much for the support, but we're going to husband it. So you've given us some money for food, but we're not going to spend it right now because we can already tell we're heading to an extremely cruel winter. And what they mean by that is they've already had the experience during the summer lockdown of queuing for 2 hours in a socially distanced way outside Aldi's. And mums are saying, can you imagine what this will be like wrapping up 2 kids, knowing that we'll have to queue outside for 2 hours in the snow? It's parents saying, we have already struggled to pay our bills when there are 3 meals needing cooked a day for the whole family. We're already struggling with our food bills. We know we'll go under when we have to add heating bills to that on top. And it's parents saying things like, it was almost unbearable for our family trying to keep kids occupied, happy and safe during that period of lockdown when we could go to the park and play on the swings. But when we're going to have to keep them indoors because the weather is as it is today, there simply aren't enough toys and books in our household to keep children entertained for a weekend, never mind for the months ahead. So it's so important, and we were so grateful that the Chancellor heard the pressure on families and responded so emphatically with both the furlough scheme and the £20 a week uplift. But what we need now is some reassurance that that will continue. Because as I say, families are already terrified about what's going to happen to them in the winter and then in the months beyond. So it would be enormously appreciated if the Chancellor were to offer some reassurance that the £20 uplift will remain. Likewise, it would be hugely welcome if the government were to follow through on the recommendations that Henry has talked about, and from Save the Children's own research, and I'm sure Vicky may have some thoughts on this too, to think through what we do about the upfront costs associated with childcare for claimants of universal credit. So just in closing, Paul, if I may, the key thing that I think will be the test of our success. So if these policy recommendations are adopted, if Henry's recommendations are taken forward, one of the ways we'll know we've succeeded is if children's own experiences and their description of them are different. If they feel less panicked and stressed than they do at the moment because they know that their mum is worrying about the bills. No child should know when payday is or when the universal credit is going to hit their parents' bank account. No child should know that, but currently they do. So for me, a big success will be our children describing their own reality differently. And with our emergency grants programme, we've been enormously lucky to have support from a corporate partner in Lego, who's made sure that when we give emergency packs to families, there's a toy and treat in them for each child. And what children, even quite small children, have said to us on the receipt of those is, oh, that's just for me. So they do know that their mum's getting help with vouchers, but a child shouldn't really have to worry about who's paying the bill at Argos or at Aldi. They've said, oh, someone's thinking about me. That's what this Lego means. Someone thinks I'm important. A stranger is thinking about me. And for me, that will be the real test of success. When children think, every child in the country thinks someone out there is thinking about me, that'll be the test of our success, I think.
Thank you very much. While I'm waiting for, we're waiting for Vikki Waterman to come back in, Minister, I'm going to turn to you. I'm very pleased to have Vicky Ford here, Under Secretary of State with responsibility for children and families. I'm sure, Vicky, you'll obviously want to talk about what the government's doing, and inevitably, at times like these, and indeed at all times, you're going to have people asking for government to do more and to do very specific things, as Kirsty and Henry have just communicated. So I suppose in particular, you'll want to deal with some of Henry's points, which are really largely about access to universal credit. So perhaps you'd like to speak to us now.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for organising this, and it is such an important issue. I took on the brief as the Minister for Children and Families back in February, just weeks before the pandemic hit us, and my brief covers looking at some of the most vulnerable children in our society, so children in care, children on the edge of care, children with special educational needs and disabilities, those children and young people who are in alternative provision and not in mainstream school. It also covers mental health and well-being, early years, and food. So it is some of the very most vulnerable children that we have across the country. And there is no doubt that children and their families have found this an incredibly challenging time. And certain groups of those families will have felt it even more than others, especially children with disabilities and their families will have found this very, very challenging. So my role has been to keep focusing on the most vulnerable. I'm actually very proud that UK was one of the few countries in the world that kept schools open for vulnerable children. Vulnerable children meaning those with a social worker and those with education, health and care plans, because we know how important school is to keep them safe, keep them away from harm and for their own health and well-being. And of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, it wasn't possible for all of those children to attend. Some of them may have had other underlying medical conditions, which meant that they were safer at home. But as we saw the summer term numbers grow, we saw more and more vulnerable children coming back to school. We also, during the pandemic, set up what I saw as networks of support for different vulnerable groups. So, for example, adoptive families often have extra pressures, so we invested more funding in the adoption support fund. We increased the amount of money in the family fund, which gives grants to families on low income for children with severe disabilities and critical medical conditions. We were very concerned, of course, about children at risk of harm in the home, so we ran a massive campaign with the NSPCC, increasing the capacity at Childline and promoting that really, really important helpline for anyone who thought that a child was at risk of abuse or neglect. And that campaign definitely saved lives in terms of making sure that more children were being referred into services. We've also been working with Barnardo's for children, especially young people who are at risk of being drawn into harm, such as county lines and other criminal activities. Mental health and well-being has been a very significant part of my brief. We've put unprecedented amounts of support into help teachers, especially rolling out the new curriculum on mental health and well-being through the RSHE. We trained over 10,000 teachers in webinars over the summer, and now we've just launched the Wellbeing for Education Return Scheme. It's an £8 million scheme which allows teachers to make touch with local experts to provide them teaching and guidance on how to support with wellbeing. We also, of course, launched the free school meal voucher system whilst the majority of schools were closed. £380 million went out to low-income families under that voucher system. I have to admit, Paul, it was jolly challenging to get something that scale off the ground, and we had quite a lot of teething problems, but it did provide a huge amount of support to the 1.3 million children and young people who are normally receive free school meals every day. Other groups such as care leavers, who often have enormous challenges and can feel very isolated at this time, we rolled out support for them, especially through the delivery of laptops and devices. Over 200,000 laptops and devices went out to children and young people and care leavers, and there's another 150,000 going out now to any schools that may need to close. I mean, the most important thing that we've done for children and young people, though, is get them back into school. It's so important for their health, their well-being, their safeguarding for those that are at risk. And it's great news that it's around 90% of children are back into school. Over 80% of those with education, health and care plans are back into school. I think it was 99.8% of schools were open last week. Some of them have had to send home certain groups or bubbles if they've had a case of coronavirus, but well over 90% of schools are open to all classes in all year groups and not having to send them home at the moment. So that is really, really important. And of course, since the schools have reopened, the free school meal and meal provision has restarted. I agree with Henry about the issue of lunch boxes. And I am a bit concerned at the moment that some of the school meal providers have said that more parents are sending in lunch boxes rather than not necessarily the free school meal families, but families of children who would normally buy a meal at school, especially secondary, may be sending in lunch boxes at the moment. And I can understand that, because dining rooms in secondary schools can often be very busy places, and the schools are trying to keep the young people socially distanced at the moment. But it is important that the lunchbox is in a good state. And one of the things that we've worked with the school meals providers is to encourage them that if a child does need to self-isolate because of the coronavirus, that they would be given a food box, normally a weekly food box, to support them at that time if they weren't getting their free school meal at home. We've also rolled out free school meals to certain very vulnerable groups who weren't getting them, including some of those who are on no recourse to public funds, because we really at this time wanted to support them. I think you mentioned at the beginning, Paul, the exams challenge. It actually sits with the Secretary of State and the Schools Minister and the University Minister, who've all worked incredibly hard on this. And of course, it was really, really challenging for many young people. But it was also good news that more young people from disadvantaged backgrounds have gone to university than ever before. And I think we mustn't forget the really positive achievement that we've done over the past decade of closing that attainment gap. It did widen slightly last year, but the trend has been to close the attainment gap. And in my brief, I'm very, very proud of what we've done for early years, because if you start school at a good state of readiness, you've got your building block for life, okay? But if you are already falling behind by the time you start school, that attainment gap only gets wider. And 8 years ago, it was only 1 in 2 children had that good state of readiness. It's now 72%, so 3 out of 4 children. And that is a massive improvement to children's lives. So continuing to focus on the early years experience is really important. Now, we know that the attainment gap will probably have widened again because of COVID. And that is concerning, but that's why we've put the £1 billion of catch-up funding into schools. 350 million of that is particularly from those from disadvantaged backgrounds to help them get this one-on-one and small group tutoring, and that will be launching and going through the year. One other thing that I'm very proud of that we've done in recent years is the support for care leavers. So if you look back at care leavers, they often have the worst outcomes. They're the quarter of our NEETs, quarter of our homelessness, quarter of those in prison have been care leavers, and it's just shocking. But one of the reasons that was happening is that care leavers historically had some of the lowest rates of attendance at school and the highest rates of permanent exclusion. So they weren't finishing school. And a few years ago, we brought in place a project called the Virtual School Head, which in every local authority is a special school head to support children in care. And now I'm pleased to say that you are more likely to finish school and not be permanently excluded if you're a child in care than if you're a child living with your own family. So it's a phenomenal turnaround for that very vulnerable group. We can't underestimate the challenges ahead. It's going to be a very difficult year. Some of you have mentioned the extra £20 that went on universal credit. That's great. The furlough scheme's obviously been fantastic for many families. The job support scheme, I hope, will help many others as well. I'm very proud, actually, of the attention that's come from across government into the children and families brief. So, for example, just before the summer, I worked with ministers in DEFRA, ministers in MHCLG, ministers in the DCMS to set up the local authority welfare support scheme to really help those families that need urgent access to food and essentials now. And £63 million more money went into local authorities for that scheme. And that was just one example of the cross-government support. And another thing, if I can give a final note and a little bit of an advertisement, across the civil service a few years ago, we launched the Care Leaver Covenant to support our really vulnerable care leavers, and a care leavers internship programme to give them the first experience of rung on the ladder. And some people said in COVID that this year we wouldn't be able to do that internship project, it would be too difficult. And I absolutely said no, the role of government must be to support the most vulnerable and lead from the front. Now is the time when we really must make sure that we have those opportunities for young people. And ministers from all across government and government departments stepped up to the mark. There's 550 internships on offer, more than double any previous year, all over the country. The closing date is the 13th of October. So if you are a care leaver or care experienced, please do go on gov.uk and look at those paid opportunities across the country to get that start on your career.
Minister, I'm very grateful to you for setting out what the government's doing, and very glad to have provided a forum which you've got the chance to do that. Now, we'll go to general questions soon, but at this point, what I think I'm going to do is as follows. We've been joined by Vikki Waterman, who's a parent and campaigner. She's been campaigning with Save the Children for about 2 years and has got 2 young kids. So I thought what we'd do next is let Vikki in. I'm presuming she's going to talk quite a bit about her own experience. When that's happened, Minister, I'll ask you briefly to respond to that, and then we'll go into questions. So Vikki Waterman, do come in when you can.
Thank you. We have had a few problems with tech this morning, so I apologise. I've not been able to hear what you've been saying. So I do apologise if anything seems a little bit out of context, but I'll give you a bit of a background on what I've been doing and my kind of overall opinions on things and the way that they are at the moment. My name's Vikki Waterman. I'm 36. I've got 2 young girls that are 6 and 3. And I work full-time as a treatment coordinator for private dentistry in the North East. So I'm currently in North West Durham. And I've been doing that for a few years. When I went back to work initially, I had 2 children under the age of 3, and I became a single parent shortly after my second child was born. She was only a few weeks old, quite unexpectedly. So in order for me to go back to work, I had to pay £1,600 of upfront childcare costs, which was a shock. I can remember thinking, there must be another way. This can't be the way that they do it. Because I'd gone back to work and my circumstances had changed, I was put onto the universal credit system. So I can remember getting in touch with somebody and seeing an advert for the Save the Children campaign, the Make Childcare Work campaign, and I got involved in it then, and that was over 2 years ago now. So we've done various different things. You know, we've given evidence to the Department of Work and Pension Select Committee. We've been to Downing Street. We hosted a roundtable event last year for various MPs just to discuss the issues with upfront costs particularly. And the campaign has now grown. So we've got quite a few mums from up and down the country in different circumstances, different areas of the country. Some of them live in central London, you know, I'm much further north, all struggling with the same issues with relation to childcare. So the upfront cost and the 5-week wait generally is one thing that we struggle with. And it's not just something that we struggled with initially, but it's something that's an ongoing struggle. So, for example, when children are off school during the 6 weeks holidays or during half term, things like that, you're then not paying for childcare through that period. But then when they go back to childcare, again, you've got another upfront cost to overcome. So, I mean, for families that are already on the breadline or technically living in poverty, low income families, though finding those upfront costs every few months, every 3 months or so, and trying to balance the books when the incomings and outcomes are quite different is often a struggle. I had that problem. I was furloughed during lockdown for a few months, so then I had to come up again with an upfront cost for my youngest going back to nursery before I went back to work. So it does, you are struggling with, there's not any flexibility in it either. I do think the childcare situation does need to be looked at, and things do need to change, because we talk about low income families. I wouldn't necessarily class myself as a low income family. However, my disposable income is minimal. I work full time, as do most of the other mums in the campaign, yet what they're bringing into their household, the majority goes out on childcare costs. And, you know, this is something that does need to be looked at. I do think with regards to the £20 uplift, that's huge. That's absolutely fantastic. You know, it's something that's needed to be done for a little while. And, you know, we're talking about going into potentially another lockdown or, you know, more restrictions, and a lot of women particularly are in kind of the retail sector and things like that, and we are hardest hit. 90% of single parents are women, so it is something that I would advise the government to work alongside us and work with us as support, and we'll advise on what works. We're the ones that are in this system, and we're the ones that have been claiming universal credit for 2 years now. So we're more than happy to kind of say, you know, we think this would potentially work. And there are some simple things that could potentially be changed that I do think would be hugely beneficial to single working parents that are on the breadline at the moment.
Vicky, thank you very much. Minister, as I said, that's a deeply personal account from Vicky. Perhaps you just like to say something in response.
I would sadly, Paul, there were some technical challenges of me hearing Vicky, and I think she's having a technical challenge hearing me. However, so I will listen back, but I have been told the majority of what she said. So it is really, really challenging for mums and families and early years providers and childcare providers, especially during lockdown. We have put a massive amount of support into the childcare sector. So we are funding early years providers at the same level as we were funding them before. The government bulk buys a certain number of childcare hours, so for 3 and 4 year olds 30 hours, and then for parents of disadvantaged 2-year-olds another 15 hours, and we've been bulk buying those hours at the same levels of attendance as we had pre-COVID. So even if settings have had to close, even if there's been fewer children attending, we've still been providing the childcare providers with that income, as well as enabling them to use the furlough scheme for the lost income they would have had from private sources and other sources. I was very concerned to hear that some childcare providers were still billing parents full time, even if they weren't open, and even when we were giving them this other support. So we've asked childcare providers to really be mindful of the pressure that was putting on families' income. It's also, for many families, they rely on the wraparound care at schools, the breakfast clubs, the after-school clubs, and we've really encouraged families to get those up and running. The government obviously has a manifesto commitment to invest a further £1 billion into holiday and wraparound care from next year. We're obviously in the middle of a spending review, so I can't give you more details on that, but that is recognised in the general election as a major issue that we need to support families and helping parents to get back to work with the costs of childcare.
Minister, thank you. I'm just going to ask you one specific follow-up on the questions we've had, and then we'll go over to something that the whole panel can discuss. But on his interim report, Henry said 3 things in relation to universal credit. His interim report asks for the value of Healthy Start vouchers to be increased to £4.25 a week, spent on fruit, vegetable and milk, to be expanded to every pregnant woman and to all households with children under 4. Wanted the holiday activity and food programme expanded to all areas in England, and then eligibility for free school meal scheme to include every child up to the age of 16, and again from a household where a parent or guardian is in receipt of universal credit or equivalent benefits. I wanted to ask you your reaction to that, bearing in mind, of course, that you're neither a minister at the Treasury, where you have to sign the spending up, nor indeed are you responsible for universal credit, because that sits over at the Department of Work and Pensions. But the responsibility for being children's minister's got to sit somewhere, and it sat for a while at the Education Department. So what's your reaction to those questions from Henry's interim report?
So Henry and others have worked very, very hard on this report, and I really would like to thank them for that report. The holiday activities and food project that we ran in 17 local authorities this year was enormously successful, and really has helped to break that evidence from the Department of Education Minister. We look at that long summer holiday and how important it is to give children some other structured activities during that, so that they don't come back to school after a long summer holiday having not seen any structured activities. It's really important for them. So as I've just mentioned, there was a manifesto commitment for more holiday and wraparound care starting from next year. And I can't speak ahead of the spending review on that, obviously, but that is very much something that we are focused on as a manifesto commitment. In terms of universal credit, it's really important to remember that universal credit is an in-work benefit. So there can be some families who are signed up to universal credit who are actually earning quite significant amounts of money, and others on lower incomes as well. So at the moment it covers 1.3 million children. Obviously I'm very much speaking to colleagues over at DWP about making sure that it really is capturing those who are on the lowest income, who most need that free school meal support. But I'm sure Henry understands that as an in-work benefit, sometimes you can have a family that's earning more, considerably more than others. So we want to make sure it is very targeted. But obviously we are looking at the reports, and I know that Henry will be wanting to discuss that further with me. The Healthy Start vouchers sit within the Department for Health, and they obviously have been a massive support to a lot of mothers, and I know that he will continue to raise that with them. But as I said, it's the middle of a spending review, so I can't actually comment on that all right now.
Thank you. Obviously, Henry may or may not say something about that in a moment, but I thought at this point we broadened the discussion, and I wanted to ask about what I thought was probably the political event of the year so far in relation to food and kids. I kind of wanted to ask you all about Marcus Rashford, because the person who's made the most
The point about Marcus Rashford is that what was powerful about it was the personal testimony. So good policy is made where data and analysis meets personal testimony. You have to check the two against each other. It's very hard for most people to understand, people like me, to understand what it is like to be in that situation when you are worried about putting the next, the food on the table. And what he did was he brought that to life, and he brought that voice of those people and gave it voice. And I think what Vicky was saying about the top people on universal credit, I think it's another really good example of that. We've dug into what does it feel like to be in working benefits at the top end, someone who earns, I can't remember the phrase that Vicky Ford used, but someone who has a bit more money. And actually, the words of someone actually pretty high up in Treasury, they said to me as we were looking through specific people who would be in that situation, is at the top end of universal credit, you are in a situation where if something goes wrong, your life can still spiral out of control. And so what I think Marcus did well is he took the numbers and he gave voice to them. And I'm really pleased that he's doing that as well with my three recommendations. And he got in touch with me at the end of the summer, completely out of the blue, to say he wanted to do that. But I think that people who haven't had experience can't really feel what it's like, even at the top, even at the wealthier end, supposedly, of universal benefits. It is a precarious existence, and we need to protect those children.
Thank you. Kirsty.
I couldn't agree with Henry more about the authenticity and the power of personal testimony. We've heard from Vicky today. Some of the work that Save the Children's done over the summer that we thought was most effective has been getting out the way and giving platform to others, whether that's Yemeni children who live in Britain or children of the Rohingya diaspora. We've done a lot of work over the summer to try and provide a platform for others just to tell their truths and their experiences. To Henry's point about the kind of the imaginative leap that you have to make to think through what it might be like, that what just one thing, the fridge ceasing to work or the heating going on the blink, putting your life out of control. I think the imaginative leap that is easier for people who haven't had the experience of poverty to make is not to imagine in a very literal way being poor, but to imagine being left out. Because that is in essence the experience of poverty. It's feeling that you're not part of things. So it's as a kid saying, there's no point even asking whether I can go on the school trip, because even though the entry to the museum is free, having a Ribena in the tea room won't be free. So there's no point even asking mum whether I can go. There's no point asking whether I can have a friend over for tea, because there's not enough, I can see there's not enough food in the cupboard to go round. I'm a bit embarrassed to invite a friend back to play because there's no space even for me to play, never mind for me and another little one. And that's what poverty does to people. It fractures the bonds of belonging, that in a class, every single person in the class should be able to have someone over for tea. Everyone should be able to have a birthday party and know that there's enough money for just a cake. And that's not the experience of children growing up in poverty. And I think even for really quite wealthy people, it's not that difficult an imaginative leap to say, what an awful experience of being left out. Because all of us have had the experience of being left out, of not being invited to a party or a wedding that perhaps we thought we would be, or realising that someone isn't as close a friend as perhaps we thought they were. That experience is universal. And as I say, that's the sort of emotional tenor of poverty. It fractures the bonds between people. And I think Marcus Rashford did a great job of helping people make the imaginative leap to what it's like to be hungry. permanently, persistently, consistently, even if that's not your everyday experience as someone who's a bit better off.
Minister Marcus Rashford, I mean, I saw someone intervened on you very early in the debate on Westminster Hall bringing Marcus Rashford up after it happened. I don't know what your memory of his campaign is as a working minister who would have been sort of responsive for it. What was your memory of it, your take on it?
So Marcus spoke with great passion and really struck the whole nation about the issues that he had faced as a child, and raising the whole issue of food poverty for young children. And that, I think, is really important. He's got a very powerful voice on that issue. He'd worked very well with charity Fair Share, which actually the government put a considerable amount of money into Fair Share as well, to working together. And we've worked with many different charity over this time. The one of the things that struck me is I think it is very challenging this time, and the pandemic is putting extra stress on many families. But I also recalled when I read Marcus's letter, and I think I mentioned it in the House, his experience was 10 years ago. And over the past 10 years, the government really has worked to try and lift the incomes and lower the taxes of those on lowering incomes. I think to the tune of £6,000 now a year more in the pockets of those on the lowest incomes, by the continual decrease in the tax burden and the increase in the national living wage. So it's, we need to continue focusing on that issue of helping those who are on lowest incomes most, and helping those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And that's what I will continue to do all the time in this job.
Vikki, I'll just come to you in a moment, but just a very quick supplementary. We had a question, here's the first one really, it's not from me, from Zoe, who's the project manager at Food Foundation, who asked inevitably, well, since the government ensured that children were eligible in the summer, what happens in the October half term and Christmas holidays and indeed next summer?
So obviously, since the school kitchens have been open, we've been expecting to get food out to children. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, we've set up that £63 million grant for food or other essentials. I think Henry mentioned, it is for other essentials as well. So if the fridge breaks, if there's another crisis, it is for other essential items. So that support network is there as well.
Okay, Vikki, do come in. Marcus Rashford, what was your reaction, as it were, sort of as another campaigner?
I think it was quite telling that as a now successful sportsman, he's obviously still deeply affected by something that happened in his youth. That food poverty was something that affected him that much that he felt the need to thrust himself into a political arena in the middle of a pandemic. The campaign was absolutely successful, and I backed that 100%. However, it was also a little bit disappointing that it took that for the government to then go ahead and do what they did. Don't get me wrong, I fully support with regards to the food vouchers and things like that, absolutely. The government has already shown that it does want to support families throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially with the £20 uplift lifeline. I do think it needs to go that step further and make that permanent. Absolutely. And with regards to a personal level with the Marcus Rashford thing, he constantly praises his mum, praises, that she was working as much as she could and she was doing what she could. And I do think as a whole, we do need to stop shaming single parent families and change the narrative when it comes to that as well.
Okay. I'm going to go to a question now from Councillor Samantha Harvey, who says, child poverty is a stain on society with the pandemic. It can only get worse. how do we identify the urgent needs of families and children affected by COVID? Kirsty.
So I think Henry's made the very interesting point about the families at the margin. And that's where we have focused our own Save the Children emergency response. So we're focusing on the 10,000 children who will get pulled into poverty as a result of the pandemic. Because as the minister's just laid out, for people who already have a statutory relationship with social services, for example, it's not to say that life for them is easy by any means, but there is already system in place to help the most vulnerable children and people who are in contact with social services, as I say. So for us, there's that rim of children who are the families are on the margin of access to that kind of support, but the cliff edge is huge. So that's where we're focusing our attention, is people who aren't eligible for various forms of statutory support, aren't eligible for various forms of benefit, but there's a real risk of them tipping into poverty as a result of this. So I think there's a risk of that group of children and families being forgotten. So that's where we're putting our attention.
Henry.
Yeah, I think one of the recommendations I think the government is taking up is that during the start of the pandemic, my team went to work on how we get food to the vulnerable. And one of the things they did is Victoria Prentice, the minister, set up a team to start monitoring what was happening at the margins. We realised there had been an article in the press saying malnutrition admission to hospitals in children is increasing. And the government didn't know, and the government needs to be the first to know that. So I think you need to do that monitoring, and I think you also need to change your mindset. So I'm sure things have improved in the last 10 years. I don't deny it. But we're going to have, it looks like, more people out of work by the end of this year, beginning of next year, than we had in the 80s. We're going back 40 years. And not only that, but these people, a lot of them have quite high fixed costs. So they're in the housing. They're people who couldn't imagine being unemployed at the beginning of the year. I was speaking to, in my industry, hospitality, I spoke to a 45-year-old chef the other day. He was doing very well. He was being paid 60 grand. He's got a house, that requires a mortgage for that. He doesn't think he's going to get a job now. There's not going to be jobs for him for 5 years, the hospitality. So you've got these people who are going to be out of work with living in places which cost a lot, who don't have the money to support them. So I think we need to kind of reset. It's not a criticism of what the government's happened in the last 10 years. It is the fact that the world has changed beyond imagining. And there are people now whose lives are going to change beyond imagining. And the response needs to be beyond what would be imaginable at the beginning of the year.
Minister.
So again, Paul, I couldn't hear what Henry was saying, so maybe you could just, I'm terribly sorry about this technology.
Okay, I'm just going to go in that case just quickly to...
But if I could just say one thing, because just coming in what was said earlier about families who are falling into lower poverty now, and to really encourage them, especially on the school food issue, if you are falling into lower income, you can get into that free school meal at a safety net immediately. Just contact your school and speak to your school.
Okay, I think I will just ask Vicky, since the question was about urgent needs of families and children affected by COVID, what change? You've been campaigning for 2 years.
Yeah.
What change you've really noticed in terms of urgent need over the period since March, when COVID really took off?
I think it's been recognised a lot more. So I think the government seems to be a little more open to change with regards to families in work and poverty particularly. I do think the key going forward does need to be everybody working together. So at the minute, the government doesn't seem to fully grasp or understand the boundaries that are faced by single parents, particularly as we're in the grips of a pandemic. But there are charities, Save the Children, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Gingerbread, that have been shouting this from the rooftops for months and months and months, particularly since the rollout of universal credit. And I do think if they kind of open their eyes and their ears a little bit more and work alongside. I do think that would be hugely beneficial to families going forward.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Now the next question comes from Kirk Wilson, which was this: low-income families struggle with high rents and high bills and need to rely on loans, which can charge high interest rates. What can the government do to reduce this? Minister, I'll come to you first because I think you can hear me. So that seems a sensible thing to do.
So I think that, one of the really important things that the government has done and Rishi has done at this time is to make sure that people can't be evicted from their house, and the support for those who are rented in living in rental accommodation is really, really, really important. And other levels of support that others have mentioned as well, such as the increase in the universal credit, the mortgage holidays that have been given, because some people who've suddenly may own their own house but suddenly seen a significant drop in their income has put a lot of pressure on those families as well. So the mortgage holidays as well have been very helpful. So I would advise everybody who is struggling to get in touch with their job centre. I was in my own job centre just recently looking at the bespoke support that we're putting in through universal credit, but also advice on what opportunities are out there as well. Those are absolutely key packages of support that are there for individual people as well. And back to the local authority welfare assistance fund for those in crisis. It is really important.
Kirsty, loans and high bills, that's scarcely a new issue, but accentuated by COVID.
Yeah, so I think there's more that could be done about the child-sensitive elements and the child-targeting elements of some of the bits of the benefit system. So as well as keeping the £20 uplift, one of our recommendations with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is an extra £10 per week on those child-focused elements, because the pressure on family finances are so acute. Of course, there's a wider problem of poverty, but the problem of child poverty and the intersection with consumer debt is so acute at this time. It is also worth reiterating, as I say, that 7 in 10 finding that we found of people on universal credit, there's just no give in the system anymore. So if you are a family who's already cut down on your use of nappies, there's no more cutting down you can do. Children need nappies and you can't cut your food bills to zero. So everything that a family can do to husband resource and eke out what they have, they've already done. So we're now right hard up against the fact that people are having to get loans to pay for essentials, not discretionary spending, essentials. And we do think it's a strengthening of the safety net is the only real way to deal with that. It's giving families the security that they can spend at this time on their children without falling further into debt. It's only the social security system that will give that confidence, really.
Henry, you'll obviously be across this issue from the point of view of your report, because when people are struggling with their bills and they're taking loans and the loans incur high interest, they're going to have less to spend on good food and healthy food, indeed food of all kinds.
Yeah, I actually think the rent issue is a broader. It's the thing I worry about most across personal and in business, and it's the thing that it's the hardest problem I think Rishi has to solve at the moment. So you've got this rent tsunami. I mean, in my section of hospitality, no one's paid their rent since April, since the moratorium came in, and at the same as when that comes out, a whole bunch of businesses are going to go bust. And a whole bunch more people who haven't paid their rent. So resolving that issue is going to be absolutely critical. But that is beyond the scope of it's beyond my pay grade, but it certainly is something that keeps me awake at night, both in terms of our sector and in terms of the country more generally.
I mean, it's of course also outside the minister's department. So just at this point, I just wanted to take a break from the questions that are coming in, because I just got one from really for Henry, but I'd be interested to hear what everyone else has to say about an aspect of your interim recommendations, which is Brexit sounds rather a long way away from what we're discussing. And in fact, the government is busy negotiating or trying to negotiate trade deals. Trade deals have a sort of potential impact on the food that comes in. I was just very interested in this recommendation in your report where you really stress that you've got to have proper parliamentary scrutiny of these deals before they're signed off. Have you got anything you'd like to say about that?
Absolutely. So I'm actually debating this on the ConservativeHome fringe with Liz Truss tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. Fantastic time to debate trade and Brexit. But as set out, the measures that government is committed to scrutinise trade deals are the weakest of any major developed trading nation. They're weaker than America, they're weaker than Australia, they're weaker than Japan. Only New Zealand has weaker mechanisms for parliamentary scrutiny of trade deals. And the reason I think this is actually a kind of the scar of what happened in Brexit last year, where you had this tension between two democratic events, one, the referendum, and two, what was going on in Parliament. And those, as we all know, whatever your position was, collided to very damaging effect. And I wish the government would realise that this is not the same situation. One of the reasons that they gave for Brexit was to be a confident sovereign nation. And a confident sovereign nation would confidently discuss trade deals in the House. I'm not saying that the House should negotiate trade deals. There's a long and well-established precedent that that is the job of the executive. And you can't have the House picking at individual elements of trade deals. You'd never be able to get one done. But every other country in the G10 has stronger levels of scrutiny. Actually, Greg Hands hinted in the House the other day that the government might allow for more scrutiny. I just think it would be a very good, confident thing to do, and there's absolutely no downside in it.
Minister, you may not, judging by previous experience, have heard Henry's his answer. If you didn't, his argument was basically that we have one of the weakest forms of scrutiny of trade deals in the world. I mean, I suppose in a sense you could argue that we haven't had to scrutinise any really as EU members, and that we're coming to this function new. But what do you think about that? There has been a bit of a campaign to ensure better scrutiny of trade deals. Your colleague Jonathan,
if I can just put it all within the sort of school food context, and I do apologise, I'm running very low on my battery. So I do apologise if I do what my children suddenly do to me and say, sorry, Mum, I've gone. But in terms of food standards, right, we have some of the highest food standards in the world, especially those related to animal welfare. And the government has been enormously clear through manifesto commitments that we will not lower our animal welfare standards, and that means that we will not give in on issues such as hormone-fed beef and chlorinated chicken. And anybody who raises those issues, I do believe, is scaremongering. It was the first ever question I asked in the House of Commons when I became a Member of Parliament in 2017, is would we make sure that our farmers would not be undercut by lower welfare products coming from overseas as a result of Brexit. And it's absolutely clear and has remained clear throughout. So I do think it's really important that we make sure that our school food standards are upheld throughout the whole school. In terms of making sure that we have good quality food at break time as well as at lunch times is really important. In terms of Brexit, obviously, getting a deal is important for food prices. We know that, and that's why I'm very pleased that the negotiators are continuing to do that. As a former MEP, I know how much scrutiny was done to trade deals at a European level, and I'm sure that as we take back to do our own trade deals, that the detailed scrutiny will continue, and the pressure on MPs to scrutinise will be put on us by our constituents to make sure that we're looking at the detail as well. But big points. We don't want to see lower animal welfare standards or our farmers undercut by lower animal welfare standards. We do need trade deals, both for us to be able to export, but also for us to be able to import. And that is really important for making sure that we have affordable food as well, which brings us back into this whole question of making sure that families can afford food.
Kirsty, anything to add on trade, or is it?
So it's less on the trade point, more, if I may, Paul, to just single out the leadership of two other organisations, which I think is relevant here. So one is Unchecked, which is doing some great work on regulatory standards around children's food and children's toys, and making sure that we keep those high standards that the Minister has referred to. So I think they're doing great scrutiny work around that. And the other is the Five Rights Foundation that Goodman has set up to look at children's access to the internet. And so I wonder if we could have a brief discussion at some point in this session, Paul, about the digital divide, because of course that's one of the other things we've seen during the pandemic, that there's some children who haven't had access to the online learning at all, and whose parents haven't got access to online welfare support and other things that they might want. And then, of course, there's a whole other group of children who are spending much more time online than they ever have before and are exposed to all sorts of new risks as a result of that. So I think there's an interplay between trade and regulation, but I defer to others on the trade side of that who have more expertise.
Okay, well, we will come back to data in a moment. In the meantime, I've got a very simple, straightforward question from David Heathcote, who asks, are families, particularly those Henry mentions, afraid of the stigma of asking for help?
Yeah.
Who someone came in? Who?
That was me, sorry.
Well, Vicky, carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think potentially in a few years' time, my eldest daughter might be eligible for free school meals, and the thought of even having to organise that with the school puts a little bit of dread in the pit of my stomach, to be perfectly honest. So yeah, it's something that, particularly because I feel as if I am doing quite well in my career, I have got quite a good job, and yet regardless of how well I'm doing, the outgoings still far outweigh the incoming some months. So the thought of therefore having to then go to the school and discuss that kind of thing, yes, it is, there is a stigma attached to it, absolutely.
Henry?
Yeah, I thought one of the most powerful things that Marcus Rashford said in his campaign was, why is it that we're happy to ask for help if we're struggling with maths or with English, but we're not happy to ask for help if our children are struggling to eat well? And there is definitely that huge stigma. One of the things that the coalition government introduced, which actually on the back of another report I did on school food, was universal free school meals for infants. So free school meals for every child up to the age of 8. And I've been going around schools and seeing the difference in schools, even now, where largely you don't get tickets, largely it's quite hard to tell. Children can sniff out, they are brilliant at sniffing out who is on free school meals, who isn't. And the change in culture in these schools when everyone is on free school meals, where everyone eats together with the teachers, it is fantastic. And I'm afraid the stigma is a real issue. People are rightly proud, and it's a difficult thing to ask for help.
Kirsty?
I think it's all been said. I couldn't agree with Vicky and Henry's points more.
Now, we seem to have lost the minister, who is having technical problems. Talking of which, we are going to go back, Kirsty, to the digital question, because we had a question from Emma Stone, which was that some people are talking about choosing between dinner and data. Digital poverty exposed as an issue, huge impacts for poorest households. Whose job to solve is the question? Henry?
I don't know whose job to solve it. As I kind of hinted, I saw it very, very closely. So as we went into lockdown, I had 3 kids in state school, 1 in year 7 and 2 in primary school. And they all came home. They all had a screen. They all had a quiet room to work in. And at the same time, I was delivering preschool meals. Our charity was delivering preschool meals, and I saw families where they were sharing a screen, where they were working in the same room, and it was horrific. And even then, actually, because in those schools, the teachers had to put, they were struggling with the most vulnerable children, just getting out computers. The government did a fantastic job in putting that in place. And so the whole education system, the whole education of my children fell apart pretty much. And actually, we moved one of our children, our eldest, to a private school this term. And it is, I thought his state school was fantastic, but the education there, they just could not cope with what happened in COVID. And now, well, I've actually almost become someone who wants to see private schools banned, because the difference in education that my son is getting in that school now compared to what he was getting in this very good, Hackney state school is really shocking. So I don't know whose job it is to solve that, but I have seen at first hand the difference, and it has been very sobering.
Vikki, not the minister, but Vikki, just your experience firsthand as a campaigner. I mean, do you share Henry's kind of experience, which he's just described, of going into households, into homes where there may not be a screen at all, or if there is, people are, I wouldn't say fighting over a screen, but they've got to contest to use it. They haven't got their own computer. They're not able to get online easily.
I think, yeah, I mean, I do think it's something that's not, it doesn't seem as if it's as important as putting food in stomachs. So obviously, of course, if we're talking about, a laptop or something like that, I personally, in my household, we don't have a laptop. It's just lucky that throughout lockdown, my daughter's school didn't set any work that required her to do anything like that. I've got a phone. I've got a phone that I have for work, and that's about it. So yeah, luckily that wasn't the situation, but I think some schools kind of assumed that, and there were families that were struggling to be able to educate their children during lockdown because the work that was being set wasn't necessarily appropriate for them without that type of technology. So yeah, absolutely. If it's something between, if you're choosing between going food shopping, for example, and putting the money towards some technology, you're always going to put food in the cupboard first.
Kirsty, you wanted to come back to this question about
data. Yes. So I think we've seen both technology companies and charities doing their best. So there's been some great gifts in kind type work from the corporate sector, and lots of charities at a local level are trying to distribute both data and devices. And what we've seen from the past experience is just far too patchy. It's far too patchy to do the work that's required to close that educational attainment gap, I think, and we should pay tribute to the BBC. I think the BBC stepped forward as a great national institution very quickly to try and get a huge education curriculum online, and their experience with young people is they require, there's a reason that we do education the way that we do, and there's a reason that teachers do lots of interactive work with young people to help develop their critical thinking, and that's just actually not possible on the red button. So the BBC did everything it could, but it's not interactive learning in the way that, particularly as Henry mentioned, children in the independent sector were still continuing to get interactive learning delivered digitally, and for the most part children in the state sector were not getting that. And we've seen, the Minister mentioned, there has already been some progress made on closing the educational attainment gap, but we know from all the data about the so-called summer slide that all children forget things when they are out of education, but the poorest children forget the most and fall even further behind in the long summer holidays. So if we compare the long summer holidays to the amount of time that people have spent out of education and if they haven't had access to data and devices, out of interactive, immersive education of the sort that their peers in the independent sector have been getting, that education gap is inevitably going to have grown hugely over this period. So I just don't see, given it has such implications for the educational divide, and it is a problem universally felt in every single bit of each of the home 4 nations, I don't see how there's any other provider other than government that can raise the floor on that and guarantee all children access to some degree of digital education if they need it.
Minister, welcome back to that. Just don't
Thank you.
have the
Sorry
question.
about that. I did, actually. Thank you very much. And it's such an important issue because, of course, we're living in the middle of a digital revolution, and access to digital technology, being able to get online is not only vital for education, but also vital for so many other areas. So big picture, this is why it's been so important that the government has got this commitment to roll out high quality broadband across the country, and help rural areas and address rural disadvantages as well as other disadvantages. I'm very glad that Kirsty just mentioned the BBC Red Button programme. The Department for Education worked really closely with the BBC to get all those lessons online. We also established the Oak National Academy, which has set up educational resources available in every different year group in many different subjects, and included in my brief as well resources for those with special educational needs and disabilities as well. But actually having the access to a device is also key. So that project that we rolled out, I think it was 220,000 laptops and devices, and a large number of routers as well. Those were rolled out during June, particularly looking at the groups that needed it most. So for example, those students from disadvantaged backgrounds who were in year 10 and 12, so the ones who are going to be doing their GCSEs and A-levels next year, they were very much high on the list of priority there, as were care leavers. And then we now have this store of 150,000, which we're providing if schools are needing to send some children home because of local outbreaks. There's also been some really interesting work with some of the different data providers to give families more data in their bundles, and for example BT did a project giving vulnerable families access to free data in where there were BT hotspots. So some really interesting projects going on there. It is a really significant issue, and we're very focused on doing all that we can at this time to make sure that we try and close that attainment gap between those from disadvantaged backgrounds and those from more advantaged backgrounds. But fundamental in all of this is that being taught in the classroom is much better than being taught in an online environment. So that key message about keeping schools open is the priority. It is a really important one to keep reminding people of.
Okay, we're moving towards the end. I have a question here from Gareth Williams, which touches on some of the ones we've had already, which is we have a very low take-up of free school meals locally from those eligible. Have you come across any ways of improving take-up that councils can learn from? Kirsty?
I'm afraid I don't have any research or evidence about that, but I'd love to hear if others do, because it's such a great question, so important.
Minister,
so if your child is entitled to free school meal, then the school also receives extra funding from a pupil premium, which carries on with the child through the rest of their school career. So schools are extremely keen to make sure that those who are entitled to free school meal get not only the meal but also the extra funding that comes into the school for the education to support those from more disadvantaged backgrounds. So schools on the whole do a very good job of encouraging those who are entitled to bring that pupil premium money into the school, that they do so. And as I said earlier on, if you do find yourself falling into a lower income than you were before, and therefore your child would be entitled to a free school meal, do contact your school because they can add you in quite quickly.
Henry, any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think on the pupil premium thing, clearly the pupil premium should be linked directly to the DWP information. And I think that the government is trying to do that, but for some reason there are technical difficulties. It might be that Minister Ford could say something about that. On improving take-up of free school meals, actually improving if you look at schools with high take-up of free school meals and high take-up of school meals, they do the same things. So they have what you call a whole school food culture, where the teachers eat with the children, the people in the canteen think about the children as customers, they serve food that the children like. It's actually just about any kind of, they have a culture of the children eating the school food. And that is, there are still, I mean, school food has got a lot better since the days of the turkey twizzler, but there is still too much out there that is beige and unpalatable and overcooked. And you will find, I wouldn't be surprised in this area if the food wasn't very good. And funnily enough, however much you need that meal, if your child is coming back from the school and the meals are absolutely terrible, you will scrabble around to get the cash to give them a packed lunch. So the way I would separate the pupil premium out, the way to increase uptake of school meals is to improve the school meals. And if anyone, by the way, chefs in schools, the charity I do, that normally in non-COVID time, that is the job we do. So if anyone wants help for their school in improving the school meals, chefsinschools.org, and we can help.
Last question, I'll take one from one of those that's coming in. May Haynes asks, our experience at local level is one where the barriers to accessing nutritious food is lack of cooking skills or no facilities for cooking. What can government do to help? Minister.
Actually, I think that's a really important question. So one of the things that we did with the holiday activities and food project this year, which was a bit different to previous years, was that we also combined with that some materials and learning on nutrition, on food preparation. And I went to see a fantastic project actually in Suffolk that was being run with many of these families, how they were supporting each other they'd get a food parcel and they were supporting each other with the recipes of what they were doing with it and teaching and learning from each other, and to actually raise that whole standard of understanding of nutrition, food preparation as well. So I think that that's been a really important part of the holiday activities and food project this year, which I personally would love to see continue into future years as well.
Vicky, you heard the question. Did you have any thoughts on it? No facilities for cooking.
That's not necessarily something that I've come across. The lack of education with regards to the ability to cook and things is certainly something. I think also as well, we're forgetting about time. So parents that have got 2 or 3 children that are working full time, it's just having that time to be able to stand and prepare nutritious food as well. And sometimes, quite often, that is something that's potentially put on the back burner. It's much easier to put something in the oven if you've been at work all day and then you've picked the children up from after school club or childcare after, and by the time you're getting home and then you have to do it all again the next day. It's not always easy to stand and cook a nutritious meal as well. So, you know, parents are worn very, very, very thin. And I think we do forget about that as well. But I do think educating parents and working together, and also them taking a little bit of the responsibility as well to be able to educate themselves a little bit on how to cook nutritious food for their children, is, you know, something that definitely needs to be looked at.
Henry.
Yeah, so I talk in the part 1 of the food strategy about the slow motion disaster that is the British diet. We cook less than any other European nation. 50% of the food that we eat is ultra processed, which is miles higher than every other nation. Part of that is down to cooking skills, and improving those skills is very important. It's difficult. As part of the school food plan that I just referred to, cooking has been on the curriculum compulsory for every child up to the age of 14 since 2013, and it still isn't happening. You can't just pass a law, unfortunately, to change this kind of stuff. It takes work on the ground, and actually a big part of what I'm thinking about in part 2 is how do you create that systemic shift? And it's not just the skills, as Vicky's alluded to, it's the equipment, not just do you have the cooking equipment, do you have a freezer so that you don't worry about wasting stuff and it doesn't get eaten? If you're at if you're really struggling, you want to cook food that children, your child will like, because if you cook them something that is slightly healthier and they reject it, you won't have money to cook something else. So there are I think we have big issues with our national diet. It's going to become a massive problem for the NHS, and these cooking skills are definitely part of it. It was the best thing, by the way, that I ever saw. There was a fantastic school I visited in Leeds, and they had, to Vicky's point about educated parents, they had a lads and dads cooking club, and they got all of the boys in the secondary school to cook with their dads, and then they had, it sounds kind of like Nirvana nowadays, you don't be able to do it now, but at the end of term, all the dads and the lads got all the mums in from the surrounding school and cooked them this big banquet. So there are fantastic things that you can do through schools to improve culture, but that sadly feels a long way away from where we are today.
Kirsty, the last word is with you.
And so I think I might end where I began, Paul, which is there are so many important micro, and I say that to mean the sense that they're distinctive rather than they're small and unimportant, but there are so many separate issues that are going up to make families' experiences at this time. And I wonder if, instead of picking off different individual solutions, we might just need a new national conversation about the problem. We might just actually need to work together, whether it's in politics or business, in campaigning or in journalism, where you are, Paul. I feel like we just all need to work together to just elevate the importance of family life in our national and public life, because I feel it's really not front and centre at the moment, but working together we might be able to get it there. And at the point where it's elevated and central, then lots of people will crowd in to help solve the problems. But we just really need a national conversation about how important these problems are as the foundational step. And I'm very confident that between the people on this call and the people who've very kindly given up their afternoon to listen in, we've got the makings of a movement there of people who could really elevate children and families' concerns to the heart of our national life.
Okay, we have to close, but rather like Kirsty, I'd like to end where we started, just by saying that so many of the issues that we've talked about and knocked around this afternoon would seem to me to be there regardless of COVID. If only we had more time, I'd like to have explored, as Kirsty said, Henry's comment a moment ago, try to find out just why it is we cook less, what that says about the work-life balance in the UK, and what it says about the way we live family life here compared to our neighbours. But we don't have that time. So all I can do is thank the panellists. Thanks, Save the Children, for co-hosting this event with us. Thank the audience. I'm sorry we didn't get around all the questions. Just say the whole event will be on YouTube again later on the ConHome channel if you want to see it. And the next event will be about supporting the economic recovery, and it will open in half an hour's time. In the meanwhile, Vicky, Minister, Kirsty, Henry, thank you all very much.
Thank you.